to say she has not been acknowledged by the critics. However, I have a kind of feminist perspective, and I say she is as good as Pound or Eliot or other male modern poets. So I always include her when I teach modern American or modern English poetry. Anyhow, you remember that Pound called HD the first imagist poet. So really, she has very distinctive qualities in her poetry that can be recognized as imagist. So that aspect we have to focus on while reading the textbook. A brief biography, okay. Hilda Doolittle was an avant-garde poet. Now you all understand the meaning of an avant-garde poet. Her poetry is, radical, has radical style and radical subject, perhaps, and untraditional. Therefore, her theme or perspective is not unconventional, is not untraditional, is not conventional, is not traditional, and includes some experiments in style, in a theme, or in subject, and so on. So clearly, what is she? Oh, she is, she may be called an avant-garde poet. Interesting about Hilda Doolittle is she wrote, a drama, a novel, a poem. She was really versatile. So she was also known as a novelist in her days. However, the major fame of HD came from, Pound's imagism, because she was one of the leading, participants in the imagist movement, which was led by Pound. So her early poems published in Poetry. Poetry is the name of the magazine, magazine name. Usually, included imagist poet, And Pound was a foreign correspondent of this magazine, Poetry. Poetry magazine was published in Chicago in the early 20s. It was very famous because of Pound and imagist movement. Anyhow, her early poems published with the help of Pound. Pound recommended HD's early poems, calling imagist poems exemplars of imagist principles. So austere in structure and diction, they blended mythology and symbolist techniques to create a verse from that was classical yet modern. Okay. We may call Pound's poetry what? I mean, he was so influenced by Oriental, literature and culture. So maybe I will call Pound's poetry Oriental yet modern, or Asian influenced yet modern. However, distinctively, HD's poetry has been called classical yet modern. So classical here means classical Greek literature. So her poems has a lot of, as you read in the previous line, Greek mythology and some Greek style symbols in her poetry. That is why her poetry is, identified as classical. Anyhow, mythology and symbolist technique is, HD's major technique, poetic technique, or shall we say poetic signature. Her initial and intense relationship with this movement, meaning Imagist movement, HD moved away from Imagism because, as I explained already, there was a feud between Pound and Lower, and Pound kind of gave up on the name Imagism and, in a fun way, rented the name to Amy Lower, calling it Imagism. However, HD took the side of Lower and participated in Amy Lower's Imagism. Why? Because Pound deserted Imagism and moved into Verticism. The movement of Verticism was led by Pound and other, artists in sculpture or fine art. So HD, being a poet, not that much interested in fine arts or sculpture, kind of distanced herself from Pound's Verticist movement. So involuntarily or sometimes voluntarily, HD took part an important role in Amy Lower's Imagism developed in America. So HD moved away from Imagism. Here we have to qualify by Pound's Imagism. Moved away Pound's Imagism and became interested in psychoanalysis, feminism, and other areas. So it is really important keywords in order to understand HD's poetry: psychoanalysis and feminism. Meaning, I pointed out that HD included mythology and symbolist techniques in her poetry. That is why her poetry is often identified as classical and modern. Now here, when she introduced or included mythology, Greek mythology, she mainly focused on mythology on women or about women. So, and when she used this symbolist technique, she used the symbols in order to represent that female characters, inner landscape, inner psychology, because she was really interested in a woman's psychology. So, in order to understand HD's poetry, psychoanalysis is very efficient and important approach. And also feminism is also important and very pertinent approach to understand HD's female characters. Although pigeonholed as an imagist throughout her career, yes. Although HD moved away from Pound's imagism, moved away Pound's imagism, she was still called an imagist, all because of Pound. So the kind of name was really, pigeonholed her as a poet. Because in most poems, some poems have distinctive qualities or characteristics of imagism, imagist poetry. However, other poems, because the length of HD's poem is very, long, but, Pound's imagism focused on the economy of language. So most imagist poetry Pound promoted was very short. However, HD's poem usually was very long. So in a way, we can say, yes, clearly HD moved away Pound's influence, and she, kind of transformed herself from an imagist poet to a feminist poet. Still, male critics focused on her early career and focused on Pound's influence and kept calling her an imagist poet. So she was kind of dissatisfied with being stamped by an imagist. However, she couldn't help it. Anyhow, pigeonholed as an imagist throughout her career. She's now acknowledged, now meaning after 1990s perhaps, now acknowledged as a variegated, innovative poet on her own, individual poet, whose work has influenced Allen Ginsberg, Robert Duncan, and Susan Howe. All these poets are very important in the history of American literature, American poetry, but not famous in Korea. Okay. Doolittle was born in Pennsylvania. Okay. Her ancestors had deep connections with the Moravian and Puritan faith. So she was not, by lineage, was not belonging to the Anglo-Saxon. That, because Pennsylvania area was the Dutch colony. So her lineage, blood lineage, was perhaps German or Dutch. So the religion is very unfamiliar to you. Moravian sect, of Christianity. Doolittle's father was an astronomer at the University of Pennsylvania. Doolittle's father was a professor. She was reared in strict Moravian tradition of her mother's family. So very, unique family religion, she had. The symbols, rituals of this group had much to do with HD's interest in images. Doolittle and her academic family soon moved up to Upper Darby upon her father's acceptance of a professorship at the University of Pennsylvania. Around this time, she met Ezra Pound in 1902, and not Doolittle, but Ezra Pound fell in love with Doolittle at first sight, they say. So they kind of started their romantic relationship. However, how much they were for in love, in 1905, Pound published a book of poems, book of love poems, and dedicated the book to Hilda, entitling it Hilda's Book. 힐다를 위한 시집, 이런 걸 하나 냈다라는 거죠. That much Pound, fell in love with HD and wanted to get married. So they were engaged. 약혼까지는 한 거예요. They were engaged. However, 1908, the engagement had been broken because of Doolittle's father. Doolittle's father did not like Pound. She later married an English poet named Richard Eldington in 1913. Their marriage, however, was not a success and was destroyed by their separation during World War I. The two would remain close, however, would work closely together in the first years of Imagism's ascendancy in avant-garde. So, yes, that is very American style, even though Ardington, HD and Ardington's married relationship was broken, they still remained close friends. So it is all because Richard Eldington was also a poet and was very much interested in Pound's imagism. Now, just like HD, Eldington, took part in Amy Lowell's imagism after he moved away from Pound. So virtually, or the initial participants of Pound's imagist movement, did not go with him when he pursued for vorticist movement. They thought vorticism was, a little too much for themselves, So kind of say all the others just said goodbye to Pound or sided with Amy Lowell. That is why Lowell could continue her own brand of imagism for 3 years. And I say her efforts were successful. At any rate, HD and Eldington got married, but their marriage didn't last. While attending college, considering the atmosphere or the age of early modern century, early 20th century, it was very, very rare for a woman to study in college. However, HD's father was unique, was untraditional because of the Moravian language, Moravian religion. So her father allowed her to study allowed her to get higher education. That is why HD could go to Bryn Mawr College and study Greek literature. That is why there was so much Greek influence on her poetry. Studied Greek literature, and virtually she could speak Greek and read Greek. So Doolittle met fellow poets Marian Moore and William Carlos Williams. So HD and Moore were very, very close friends, and HD really liked Moore, so she kind of, provided financially for Marian Moore to publish her first book of poems. And Moore was kind of, hesitant about publishing, but, Doolittle encouraged her and even, provided some finances to publish the first book of poems by Moore. That much their friendship was close. And she had also good relationship or good friendship with Carlos Williams, Actually, Carlos Williams, Pound, and HD all three were close friends. And Pound fell in love with HD, and William Carlos Williams also fell in love with HD. So she was kind of, popular, I guess. She began writing short stories and small lyrics in 1911. She moved to London. After broke up, Pound and HD again remained good friends, So after Pound left America and stayed, in London, she also moved to London to meet Pound and do something in the European countries. To do something, to publish or to pursue a literary career, because we can make a guess that her father, who was a professor and who was very strict about Moravian religion, kind of suffocated HD's creative, energy. So she wanted to have some freedom without her father's, restraints. So she went to London, and Pound, hearing about HD's coming, kind of welcomed her and introduced her to the literary community of London. And even, he included HD in the Images the movement and provided a way for her to become a poet by calling her an Imagist poet. So, it's all beyond Korean style, but we are talking about American poets. Anyhow, she went to London, and Pound helped her. She was given the Imagist poet by Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound was responsible for submitting HD's poems in Harriet Monroe's, magazine Poetry. And the 3 poems Pound sent to the editor of Poetry, Harriet Monroe, were Hermes of the Ways, Pyrrhus, and Epigram. Were well received and illustrated Pound's famous dictums for imagist creation, meaning direct treatment of the subject, a tight stripped down structure, the abandonment of meter for musical rhythm, meaning free verse. They played an important role in the development of modernist free verse. So basically, imagist poetry or modernist poetry was all free verse. They followed the flow of logic or flow of idea, not flow of musical rhythm. So they called their poetry free verse, and it was really modern to them. In this respect, HD's early poems were among the first important products of the imagist movement. So in order to understand what the imagist movement was, you may want to name Ezra Pound, HD, and Amy Lowell. All these 3, poets were critical core members of the imagist movement, and all of 3 poets shared, some imagist principles. There are 3 principles, 3 imagist principles proposed by Pound, and there are 6 imagist principles proposed by Amy Lowell. You all remember. So Pound, Lowell, and HD or published imagist poems that contain each principle. The whole poems lacked explanation, unrhymed, and lacked regular beat because they are imagist poetry and they are free verse. But all imagist poetry share one thing: the power of image, the power of the strong image, one strong image, which we call a complex of emotional and intellectual responses, right? So the powerful, the strong image was always there in imagist poetry. The power of image was relied on to gain attention and convey emotion. HD was also known among also known to literary scene in London, and became friends with May Sinclair, D.H. Lawrence. Richard Eldington was her husband, married. With the outbreak of World War I, HD soon found herself at the head of Imagism's institutional mechanisms. This means, Amy Lowell, even though she was the leader, practical leader of the Imagist group, she kind of stepped one step back and made HD as the head of the Imagist movement, because HD was tall and thin and kind of recognized as her beauty in appearance. So Amy Lowell, who thought herself as ugly and fat and kind of businesswoman, she didn't want to appear in front of the public, so she kind of hide behind the shadow of HD. So suddenly, HD found herself at the head of Imagism, became the literary editor of The Egoist, and helped Pound with Des Imagistes. Des Imagistes is a French, in English, The Imagists. it was the book title Amy Lowell published in America, 1915. In 1918, H.D. separated from Ellington and began to live and travel with Breyer. Breyer is a kind of nickname, but her full name was Annie Winifred Ellerman. So I don't know, because many scholars, find the relationship between Breyer and H.D. a lesbian. However, in Korea, women get together and share really, really close relationship. And sometimes, two female friends, just sleep together in one bed. We share one bed. That doesn't make that two women a lesbian relationship. It is just close friends. However, in the Western culture, in American culture, I already mentioned the Boston marriage. There was the kind of concept of two women living together or sharing one bed. Then they were called a lesbian relationship, lesbian couple. So HD and Breyer were also viewed as a lesbian couple. But I don't know with whom she would have an intense relationship for the next 30 years. Because HD and Ellington broke up and they had a daughter, and HD was so fragile. She was so sensitive and couldn't have any emotional or physical strength, to raise a kid. And Breyer, who was mentally and physically strong, came in and helped all the things to take care of HD's child, baby daughter. So that is why they couldn't help, living together, I think. Anyhow, during the year 1919, HD went through many tragedies. HD's brother was killed in the World War I in France. Her father died. Her marriage finally ended. Friendship with Ezra Pound and B.G. Lawrence faded and gave birth to a daughter who Ellington said was not his child. Yes, that was a really big blow to HD. Clearly, she had none but Ellington. And Ellington, told her that, oh, the baby is not mine. So that must have been a really, really, truly great shock to HD. And Breyer was there to take care of HD and HD's daughter. So Breyer rescued her from emotional and financial troubles. That is why, because she underwent so many tragedies in her life, one death after another. She kind of was interested in her own psychological responses. So she underwent psychoanalysis with the famous Sigmund Freud himself. She went to his clinic, and Freud gave a psychoanalysis of HD. That is why she must have been very interested in female psychology. That is why she wanted to introduce or include female characters in Greek mythology and kind of try to provide their inner landscape in her poetry, which made her poetry, as I already mentioned, classical and modern. Anyhow, she went through psychoanalysis with Sigmund Freud. Her work began to take a more autobiographical bent, abandoning imagism and the ideas of impersonality. HD became interested in mysticism and mythical patterns. So these are also, another similar, but, another feature of HD's poetry, mysticism and mythical patterns. Mythical here means Greek myths or Roman myths or any other word myths, mythical patterns. Exploring ancient Greek culture in an attempt to find archetypes. Archetypes meaning symbols, archetypes that undergirded and resonated with her own personal experiences. Her last major work, Helen in Egypt. This is really famous collection of poems, by H.D. So there is a poem called Helen. So just as you memorized Pound and his famous poem, Hugh Selwyn Mobley, you had better memorize H.D. and Helen, her famous poem, Helen, H.D. Helen, because she kind of identified herself, as Helen in Greek mythology. You all know some information or knowledge of Helen, right? In Greek mythology. Who is Helen? 장희상 있어요? 없는가? 없는가 보네, 장희상이. 그 다음에 그러면은 딜쇼도 있어요? 딜쇼도 사라졌네. 있어요? 네. Can you tell us who Helen is in Greek mythology? 헬렌이 누구예요? 신화에서?
모르겠습니다.
잘 모르겠어요. 그러면 능은 어때요? 능, do you know some knowledge about Helen in mythology? Yes. Helen of Troy, that Helen we are talking about. So can you tell us something more about Helen of Troy? Not in Egypt, but Sparta and Greece. Troy and Greece. Okay, show us the reason why. Helen is famous for 뭘로 유명해요, 헬렌? 헬렌은 서양에서 in the whole Western culture, in the West, Helen is the symbol of beauty. 너무 아름다운 여자 하면 헬렌인 거예요. 미인하면 헬렌인 거예요. 근데 in Eastern culture, 동양에서는 아름다운 여자, symbol of beauty 하면 양귀비라고 얘기하는 거잖아요. 그죠? 그런 것처럼 뭐 서양에 헬렌이 있으면 동양에는 양귀비가 있다. 뭐 이럴 정도인 거죠. 그래서 너무너무 예쁘니까 Helen was so beautiful that so many men wanted to get married to her. 너무나 많은 사람들이 결혼하고 싶었던 거예요. 그러니까 regardless of age. 나이에 상관없이 모든 사람들은 다 헬렌하고 결혼하고 싶었던 거예요. 그래서 there was 그 아가멤논의 그 브라더가 메넬라우스라고 하는 사람이 있어요. Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother. 이 Menelaus was about in his 60s. 한 60세 정도의 할아버지였어요. 그리고 헬렌 was in her teens. 10대 소녀였어요. 근데 proposed and got married to Helen. 메넬라우스랑 헬렌이랑 결혼을 한 거예요. 60대 할아버지랑 10대 소녀가 결혼한 거예요. 그러니까 정략 결혼을 한 거죠. 그러니까는 헬렌이 결혼을 했으나 we may make a guess about her psychology. She suddenly became a wife of a grandpa. 그런 거잖아요. 그랬는데 때마침 이제 그 메넬라우스하고 이제 헬렌이 어느 날 이제 gave a party, 파티를 열었어요. 근데 그때 to the party Paris, Prince of Troy, 트로이의 이제 그 왕자인 페리스가 invite 초청을 받은 거예요. 그래서 Paris fell in love with Helen at first sight. 첫눈에 뿅 간 거예요. 근데 Paris was like in his late teens or early 20s, 20세 초반 청년이었단 말이죠. 그런데다가 이제 그 페리스는 was a beautiful, handsome young man이었어요. 너무 잘생긴 미남 청년이었어요. 그래서 헬렌한테 빠져서 asked Helen to elope with him to his hometown. 자기 고향으로 트로이로 이렇게 헬렌한테 도망가자라고 했어요. 그래가지고 even though Helen was the queen이었는데 여왕이었는데 gave up on every privilege and went to Troy with Paris. 도망을 간 거예요. 그러니까는 이 그리스에서는 메넬라우스가 was angry about being robbed of a queen of the queen and his wife. 왕의 그 부인이자 이 여왕이 납치됐다고 이렇게 한 거고 그래서 그 waged a war 전쟁을 하자라고 한 거고 그래서 all began the whole Trojan War 트로이 전쟁이 시작된 거죠. 그래서 reason of Trojan War is Helen이라고 하는 이야기가 she was so beautiful and every man wanted to have her as a kind of possession, 소유물로 갖고 싶었다는 거예요. So in reading whatever stories about Helen, you always find that narrative. Helen was so beautiful and she just eloped with a young man. And there was no story about her inner reasons, inner psyche, 속마음에 대해서 얘기하는 스토리 하나도 없었다는 거예요. How, unhappy she might have been in a marriage relationship, how restless she must have been in Troy during the war, or how deep she felt her guilty about, about being the reason to sacrifice all lives. So how much remorse she must have had to, made a wrong choice. All that kind of, personal feelings and emotions or inner psychological turmoil had never been talked about in the stories constructed or made by male writers. So Helen made an issue with that point from a woman poet's point of view. That is why she is called a feminist poet. 그래서 in this, this is the title of the book, Helen in Egypt. In this collection, she shows, Helen's, psychological turmoil or psychology. In a way, HD grappled with these transhistorical or transcultural concerns because, in a way, she went through the same psychology. during the relationship with Eldington, relationship with her father, authoritative professor father, and relationship with Ezra Pound, and things like that. So she underwent a lot in terms of mentality or psychology. And even, as I already mentioned, the accusation that she gave birth to a daughter outside the marriage, that was kind of unthinkable. So by using Helen as a major symbol, she wanted to present a woman's psychology. Anyhow, you have to remember the relationship between HD and Helen figure. HD is perhaps most notable for her constantly shifting formal practices and philosophical underpinnings. So in 1916, Sea Garden is another famous book of poems by HD. In this collection, HD presented many imagist poems. So Sea Garden is a collection encapsulated imagism at its most powerful. Later collection of poems, the title of the book, Palimpsest, was a hybrid form, mixed form, part novel and part poem. So it is an experimental book of poems. Used the stream of consciousness technique. Stream of consciousness technique was habitually, usually, often used by uh, modern writers like James Joyce or William Faulkner or Virginia Woolf. So if you take the course 20th century British novel, then you must have been familiar with this concept, the stream of consciousness. There is no unilateral time frame of a character and character's story. A character just to think about the present and suddenly go back to her past and then suddenly go, come back to the present and do something and then suddenly go back to according to the stream of the character's consciousness. That was very unconventional and untraditional and avant-garde, technique. Her trilogy, published from 1944 to 1946, was a powerful response to the experiences of World War I and a fine instance of the modernist tendency to relate contemporary event to mythic substructure. So this is also important, characteristic of HD's poetry, because she heavily used Greek mythology and mythic themes and mythic characters. She kind of interpreted Greek myths and mythological narrative, mythological characters in terms of contemporary setting, meaning in terms of modern, early modern period, So even though she introduced the Helen character, Helen, from the mythology, she refigured her as a modern woman in her poems. So this sentence means that kind of reinterpretation of Greek theme, Greek mythological theme, mythological characters. In other words, relate to contemporary events to mythic substructure. Finally, in 1956, tribute to Freud, she published a collection of essays on Freud, a classical example of engagement between modernism and psychoanalysis. She died of the flu, and she wrote her own epitaph, HD. So you may say Greek flower, Greek ecstasy, reclaims forever one who died, following intricate songs lost to measure. So all these, short sentences encapsulated the person who she had been, who she was. Anyhow, we can say, from a critical point of view, in HD's poems, personal meaning autobiographical and historical meaning early 20th century experiences are revealed through the use of myth, mythological structure, mythological character, mythological theme. She was also attracted to the image of Helen as an image of herself. She kind of compared herself to Helen. H.D. was upset that the story of Trojan War was related entirely by the male point of view. I already explained it. Helen never had a chance to talk, and other female characters in Greek mythology never had a chance to talk their own psyche. So, Helen kind of spoke for those silenced, silent characters or characters silenced by male writers. So she wanted to speak for those silent characters in mythology. Known for her imagist poetry with its vivid phrasing, compelling imagery, short lines, and free verse, mostly free verse. Her images come mostly from nature. Okay, so kind of she reinterpreted. As I already mentioned, she reinterpreted Greek mythology, and now again, she reinterpreted natural objects as a symbol because she, used symbolist technique. I explained, meaning use natural object to mean something else, some emotions or feelings or some ideas. Now, habitually, a rose as a natural symbol, as a natural object, had been used as a symbol of woman, or symbol of passion, symbol of love. And the rose usually was contextualized in the garden, common traditional garden. However, when H.D. talked about a rose and used a rose as a symbol of woman or love, she introduced, non-existing rose, like rose in the sea. There is no rose in the sea. 바다에 무슨 장마가 있어요? However, she kind of contextualized a rose natural, conventional, traditional symbol, natural subject in an unconventional, in an imaginary context. That way, she kind of reinterpreted traditional symbol, traditional natural object, as something else. That is why she may be called an avant-garde. Anyhow, sea, wind, sand are all traditional symbols, but she reinterpreted in her own, imaginary context. So all these rose, sea, wind became exotic figures of flowers, jewelry, and shells. Anyhow, H.D. lived a liberated life for a woman of her time. That is, she is called an avant-garde. She didn't follow the model of her time. And in this respect, H.D. shares one common thing with Amy Lowell. Amy Lowell was also, leading a liberated life for a woman of early 20th century, right? So with all this background information and biographical information, we are going to read H.D.'s three representative poems on Thursday. Okay, good job. See you on Thursday.